Oh, Israel. I feel like Michael Corleone. Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. I know I've spoken about the situation in Israel multiple times in recent months, but I don't know how not to talk about Israel this Shabbat, because although I'm not surprised, I'm heartbroken and angry about what transpired this week, and because we've just concluded Tisha B'Av, which mourns, among other things, the destruction of Jerusalem, the end of Jewish sovereignty there. But in those days, Israel was destroyed by external forces, right? The Babylonians toppled the first temple and the Israelite independence in the southern kingdom, after the north had been overrun previously by the Assyrians. And the Romans laid waste to Jerusalem in the year 70, burning Herod's majestic Beit HaMikdash and exiling our ancestors from our holiest city. All of that's true, but of course it's not the whole story. You know, sometimes the Jewish calendar seems to line up perfectly with what's happening in the world. For example, remember 2020 when we were talking about how that would be a good year to celebrate Pesach Sheni? We thought, we'll just wait a month and then we'll do Pesach because the pandemic will be over by then. Or when we languished in the wilderness of COVID while our Torah cycle placed us exactly there, Bamidbar, in the wilderness. Well, this past week, during the 9 days, the ramp up to Tisha B'Av felt so hauntingly familiar. Miriam and I saw a photo of a sign from one of the protests that read Shisha B'Av, the 6th of Av. That's the day on which the so-called Reasonableness law was passed by the Knesset. So today I want to talk not about the Romans or the Babylonians or the Grand Inquisitor or the Cossacks or the Nazis. I don't want to talk about Iran or Hezbollah or Hamas. Israel, the state, has enemies. Israel, the people, has enemies. The history of anti-Semitic hatred and its dreadful results, that history is real. The modern day external threats for American and Israeli Jews are real, but so is the threat that we Jews can pose to ourselves. The danger we face from within. The coalition government that brought 64 votes in favor of overturning the Supreme Court's reasonableness test represents two very dangerous, very ancient, and very interrelated trends within the Jewish people. One is religious fanaticism and zealotry. The other is militarism and violence. With regard to the first, fanaticism, zealotry, here's a fascinating story from the Mishnah. Barishona, kol mi sherotzeh letorem et hamizbeach torem. Initially, the practice among the priests was that whoever wishes to remove the ashes from the altar removes them. And when there were many, they run and ascend the ramp. The priest who defeats another within 4 cubits merits to remove the ashes. Okay, so let's unpack this. When you're offering up sacrifices all day, guess what? The altar very quickly accumulates ash. And it seems that at some point during temple times, it became quite desirable to be the one who removes the ashes. So picture a bunch of goody two-shoes elementary school students clamoring after class to clean the chalk erasers, okay? And how to decide who gets to clean the ashes? Apparently they would hold a race. And the fastest priest, the one who made it up the ramp to the altar, wins the privilege of clearing out the ashes. Okay, so the obvious question is, what happens if they tie? And the Mishnah relates a story about an incident when 2 priests were running side by side, ascending the ramp, and v'dachaf echad mehem et chaveiro v'nafal v'nishbara raglo. One of the priests shoved the other, who fell from the ramp and broke his leg. That's right. In order to win the race for the privilege of clearing out the schmutz from the altar, one holy religious leader hip checks the other, causing him to break a limb. But wait, it gets worse. The Gemara picks up the story and adds the following from the Tosefta. So that's a collection of material also from the 1st and 2nd centuries that didn't make it into the Mishnah. Some of the spicier stuff is in the Tosefta. An incident occurred where there were 2 priests who were equal and they were running and ascending the ramp. So far the story is just the same. Kadam echad mihem letoch arba amot shel chavero natal sakin v'takalo bilibo. One of them reached the 4 cubits before his colleague, who then took out a knife and stabbed him in the heart. So, right, to clean the ash. So what do you think the Talmud is doing here? I think, of course, it knows of this other tradition, also from the Tannaitic period, and brings it to remind us of a very important lesson, that when religious zealotry is allowed to run unchecked, there is danger for violence. It may be violence done in the heat of the moment in order to prevail over one's adversary, or it may be, as John Madden used to call it, a frustration foul. Here we have a holy man, a holy religious leader, embarrassed and angry at having been defeated in the arena of sacred service, who literally murders his fellow priest. Now, the Gemara goes on to explain that, don't worry, the guy wasn't really dead, which I can't help but imagine in the context of Monty Python, in that scene, the Bring Out Your Dead scene, where the old man shouts, "I'm not dead," as they try to load him into the cart. If you don't think the rabbis had a sense of humor, you just have to read the Gemara, they really did. And also, the text goes on to explain that they instituted a lottery system when 2 priests were of the same ability and did away with the race entirely, which kind of makes sense, and that's good. But the satirical point that the text is making is far too easy, that it is far too easy for people who think they have God in their pocket to do harm to one another. In other words, it's using humor to make a very serious point. One final thing on this story. The rabbis debate here whether to utilize the ritual of the Egla Arufa, that is the ritual of the breaking of a calf's neck, described in Parshat Shoftim, and whose purpose is to determine guilt when a dead body is found near a given town. They ultimately reject this, maybe because, well, the guy's not really dead, but also because Jerusalem is not just any town. As Adin Steinsaltz writes in his commentary on Masechet Yoma, the halacha of the heifer whose neck is broken applies only to land that was apportioned to a specific tribe of the Jewish people. Jerusalem alone was not divided among the tribes, but was shared equally by the entire nation. Jerusalem is meant to be shared by the entire nation. Think about that for a moment on this Shabbat after Tisha B'Av. But, part 2, there's a specific group of people I want to mention today because their tale locates the intersection of zealotry and violence at the time of the Chorban itself. In fact, this group is commonly referred to as the Zealots, maybe the first Zealots, a political movement which used violence and incitement to goad the Judean province into rebellion against Rome. According to Josephus Flavius, the Zealots laid siege to the temple in the year 68 CE, fighting against other Jews. In fact, they opened the gates to the Edomites, who then killed the Judean governor and overwhelmed his forces. This later led to the full Roman conquest of Jerusalem and the conquest and destruction in 70 CE. A splinter group of the Jewish zealots, you may have heard of the Sicari, were assassins who supposedly carried small daggers concealed within their cloaks in order to attack sometimes Romans, but often Roman sympathizers, and then, like ninjas, although I think predating ninjas, blending into the crowd to avoid detection. Now, the Talmud's version of the story that comes from Masechet Gittin was that during Vespasian's 3-year siege of Jerusalem, certain wealthy patrons provided supplies of wheat and barley and wine, salt, oil, and wood. The sages in Jerusalem were interested in brokering peace with the Romans, but the zealots, called the Biryonim in the Bavli, wished to engage the Romans in battle at all costs. The sages warned them, you cannot defeat them, and encouraged them to restrain themselves, at least until after the siege was lifted. So, to force a military solution, the Biryonim burned the storehouses of grain, causing a great famine in the city. In other words, they killed their own people in order to force a war. You know the rest of the story. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai slips out of the city in a casket and manages to get past the zealots who wish to pierce his body to ensure that he's dead. Until he arrives to General Vespasian, Rabbi Yochanan predicts that Caesar has died and Vespasian would now be the emperor of Rome. When the prediction proves true, Vespasian grants Rabbi Yochanan a wish, and he says famously, Tein li Yavne ve'chochameh. Give me Yavne and its sages. Jerusalem is destroyed. Rabbinic Judaism endures. The rest, as they say, is history, except history has this weird tendency to repeat itself. Chavra, we are living through a moment evocative of these Talmudic stories. We have zealots dictating in the most extreme terms and pushing Israel toward an illiberal democracy. We have racists, homophobes, religious extremists punishing Palestinians and Jewish Israelis alike. We're often told that the reason for the temple's destruction was sinat chinam, boundless hatred. That feeling is pervasive right now in Israel, and there is a real danger that we, the Jewish people, or at least members of the Jewish community, are setting Israel on a path from which it might not return. Now, I don't want to overstate this. There are powerful forces pushing back. Politicians, military commanders, reservists, pilots, the intelligence community, the legal community, the business community, the international community. This is far from over. But this Shabbos after Tisha B'Av, after a week when unreasonableness prevailed in the halls of Knesset, I believe that we should take stock. So a word about what actually happened in Jerusalem this week. The law that passed by a vote of 64 to none because the entire opposition refused to participate in a vote to dismantle democratic norms, bans all courts, including the Supreme Court, from deliberating on and ruling against governmental and ministerial decisions on the basis of a judicial standard of reasonableness. That means, for example, that the court may not rule, as they did recently, that Aryeh Deri, convicted on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, is excluded from ministerial position, from a cabinet position in the government. Because even though such a ruling, I think most of us would agree, is reasonable, the court no longer gets to make such assessments about decisions of the legislative branch. And this law is, of course, just part of a raft of legislation the Netanyahu administration is ramming through at the insistence of Yariv Levin, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, and a bunch of other zealots who have overrun the Knesset. Which brings me to this moment. Because today is not Tisha B'Av. It is, as I've mentioned, Shabbat Nachamu, a day on which we take comfort that we are not forgotten or abandoned or reduced to our most sinister elements as a people. Today we point ourselves away from destruction and toward redemption. Did you know there's a tradition that the Mashiach is to be born on Tisha B'Av? Tisha B'Av is the beginning of redemption, we hope. And a new year is coming. A year that we pray will be sweet and good. I, for one, take some comfort in the fortitude of two extraordinary women in Israel right now. First, Attorney General Gali Bar-Rav Miara, the first woman in that role who is challenging this new basic law, and Supreme Court President Esther Hayut, who wrote in 2021 that there was only one situation in which the court could strike down a basic law. They've never done it before, when such a law endangers Israel's essence as a Jewish and democratic state. Why was Jerusalem destroyed? Many reasons were given by historians and by our sages. There were external and internal forces, to be sure, but one reason offered in Talmud, Masechet Shabbat, seems to speak to the moment. Amar Rabbi Chanina, Lo charva Yerushalayim ela bishvil shalo hochicho ze et ze. Jerusalem was destroyed because Jewish people in that generation lowered their faces to the ground and did not rebuke one another. I take great comfort in the number of Israelis not lowering their faces right now, who are raising the flag, taking to the streets, rebuking this dangerous government in the strongest terms. May their reasonableness prevail. And may we experience soon the dawning of a brighter tomorrow. Shabbat Shalom.